Good morning. I'm Deep Saini at the University of Canberra in my weekly conversation with Michelle Grattan. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Deep.
The weather's finally warming up.
Yes, thank goodness.
Yeah, as is the activity regarding the marriage ballot. The Bureau of Statistics says that the ballots have been largely mailed and it would be, that task would be complete by next week. I find it a little unusual that people are going to be making their choices while the campaign is still going on. Campaign will go on until the 7th of November, so we have a long campaign and people on both sides are expressing their opinions, and at the same time we are voting. What are the implications of that?
Well, in that way, of course, it's quite different from an ordinary election. And what people are saying is that the ballots are coming back fairly quickly. Now, this is, of course, anecdotal evidence from those who are campaigning, but it does seem that quite a lot of people get their ballot, fill it in, and if they're going to vote at all, they send it back quite rapidly. So what this means is that within a couple of weeks from now, those who are going to vote will have voted, and yet, as you say, we've got all these weeks of campaigning to go. So I think a few people will feel a bit driven mad by the politicking on both sides when it's all done and dusted for them individually.
The model itself doesn't lend very well to consider thinking about an issue and then making a decision. Right? So you could make a decision and then regret it later on.
Well, that is true, but on the other hand, you could say that most people have a view on this issue. The majority of people who are going to express an opinion already have a view, and it's a fairly simple issue at one level. If you contrast an election, then a campaign develops, there are many issues, there are arguments about detail, so it is rather different, I think, in each case.
So while this is going on, a number of businesses have come out in the favor of change of law, and they are lining up behind the yes side. What is behind this very open declaration of position on the part of the business?
I think this is an interesting aspect of the campaign. We've seen before a number of CEOs earlier in the year did sign an open letter wanting this issue settled. It does seem that business feels that it's something that concerns many of their own employees, their customers. They feel that it's an issue that resonates with the majority of people in the community, and therefore they're coming out and playing a role in the campaign and certainly not being shy of making their views felt.
This is also unusual because after all, the ballot is an individual's choice, and if a business declares its position, particularly a CEO declares its position on an issue, doesn't that put pressure on the minority that may be inclined to vote other way?
Well, some would argue that, but in the case of some CEOs, they're saying vote, but not saying how people should vote, although they are making it clear that their own views are in favour of change.
The former Prime Minister, John Howard, has waded into this debate, as he often does wade into debates, and he has called that the proposed rights and protections for religious freedoms should be spelled out before the vote occurs. Now, obviously, it is too late to do that, but government has indicated that this would be taken care of in the legislation. What do we know about the kind of legislation that's being drafted?
There's been an exposure bill earlier in the process. There's also a bill that's been prepared by one of the backbench activists, and that legislation sets out protections for churches, for people who have objections based on faith. So there are quite extensive protections already canvassed in those draft bills. If there's a yes vote, the bill would be a private member's bill, so it would still have to be worked through, but from what we've seen of those bills, that's the sort of range of protections we're talking about. But many of the no campaigners are wanting much wider protections, and I think that there would be an issue after a yes vote of just what the content of that private member's bill would be. I think that that would be contested by the losers, if you like, by the side that hadn't got its way. And given that the government wants to get this legislation through by Christmas, if there's a yes vote, that could be a complication. It was always going to be the case, I think, that if the protections weren't spelled out beforehand, in other words, if we didn't have a draft bill, that would be giving ammunition to the no case. On the other hand, the case for not spelling out those protections was to keep the question as simple as possible for people to make their decision.
Ever-present Tony Abbott is present again in the debate, and so let's set aside the issue of the marriage ballot. He's actually waded in very strongly into the area of clean energy targets, and has said clearly that if government try to legislate those targets, he is going to vote against the government. And the fear is that some backbenchers may also do that. Tell us more about this.
Well, this is just adding to Malcolm Turnbull's problems. The government, so I think we've discussed in the past, is having a lot of trouble formulating an energy policy, and this is objectively very hard, but also politically very hard. And Tony Abbott has really been ramping up the pressure in the last week or so. He's been talking out about it, he's been writing about it. There are these threats that he might cross the floor if the policy isn't acceptable. And what he's trying to do really is fan the worries and doubts among quite a few backbenchers. It's hard to know exactly how many, but quite a few, about energy policy. And we've seen Malcolm Turnbull dragged more towards the coal end of this debate, away from the clean energy targets. There's a lot of demonising of renewables going on, led by Tony Abbott. And at this point, it's quite unclear exactly where the government's policy is going to land, let alone the political implications of that landing.
Speaking of political implications, they also touch the opposition, and there is this latest news about the One Nation Senator Malcolm Roberts, who has sent a couple of emails to the wrong address inquiring about the status of his British citizenship. Tell us what actually happened there, and how that puts him in a difficult situation.
Well, he's among a whole clutch of parliamentarians, of course, who are before the High Court over their citizenship, whether they're dual citizens or not. And he was in court this week. He's always maintained that he's Australian through and through, and didn't think he was British, but at some other times he seems to suggest, well, he did think he was British, he was worried about it, he contacted the British authorities. But what came out in court this week is that, yes, he did try and contact the British authorities, but he sent the emails to the wrong address, which pretty careless, one would think. And when he didn't get a reply, you'd also think that he'd have followed up. He is someone who demands that everyone else produce evidence, and tends to be critical of others. And what we're seeing in this case is that his own actions left a lot to be desired. But how it all ends up, we'll know in a while when the High Court makes its decisions.
This duality of yardsticks to measure yourself and measure others.
Well, that's right.
Thank you, Michelle. A long weekend is coming. Enjoy the long weekend and enjoy the warmth.
Thank you, Deep.